our stories we tell ourselves involve migration. What were Adam and Eve if not refugees from Eden, right? Strangers in a land that they were forced to move to. But over the last several decades, more humans than ever have been resettling. Every year, millions of people migrate, and this trend shows no sign of declining. This is one of the most pressing issues this century, so it's vitally important to think about how mass migration is reshaping culture and how culture can help us better understand migrants. So I'm delighted to be joined today by three panelists. We have Tomas Ayuso, who is a photographer and writer whose work focuses on conflict in Latin America and Central America. We also have Danielle Villasana, who is a photojournalist whose work focuses on human rights, gender, and displacement. And we also have Wale Oyejide, who is one of the best dressed men in the US, according to Esquire. It's a shame that we can't see your outfit in full. But in addition to that, he is also a fashion designer and founder of Akira Jones, his fashion label. And you may have seen his designs in Black Panther. So, Tomas, I want to start off with you. So you have covered the migrant crisis in Honduras. Why did you choose to cover that?
Partly, well, first of all, thank you and good morning from this side of the world, specifically Tegucigalpa. And I'd say partly because it was the way that it was being covered at the time, it was a very monolithic movement of suffering that was being displayed. And in reality, in these mass displacements of people, there are, at the granular level, at the individual level, so much humanity that it expressed that is lost in the coverage and in the media. And I felt that that was important, not only as a Honduran, but as a human being, to best understand who we are, where we're going, not in a literal sense, but as a society and as a civilization. And in knowing Honduras best, I felt that I was someone who could do that in a way that would be accessible for people around the world.
I understand that your family history of migration helped shape your decision to cover that story. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, my ancestors, specifically my grandparents, were displaced from Palestine and came to Honduras. That growing up as a Palestinian Honduran myself, I was in a crossroads. I was one foot in a continent I've never seen, and another in a home that was my own. That shaped very much the experience of who I was. And when faced with the issues that are very particular to Latin America, this created a sort of cultural syncretism that really informed who I was, my political views, my cultural views. And later on, once I became a photographer, a writer, etc., I found that these sources that were the base of my identity, the pillars of my identity, were helpful in understanding where we were going. These were the movements my grandparents took when they left Palestine.
I'm having an issue with my audio, so I'm going to try these headphones from the Stone Age and see if that works at all better. Are you hearing me better now? Excellent, great. Tomas, that's really interesting. So, you've explained that you took issue with the way that this migrant crisis was being portrayed. So how did you go about portraying it differently?
Well, what I found at first glance was just these pictures of the first in the language that's used, waves, masses, and in the worst cases, much more racist language that I'll, not use in this conversation, or dehumanizing at the very least. And in the images, which is the record and the images that are perpetuated in media and eventually in history were of faceless, shapeless masses of you assume are human beings. What I felt that is not the, even though that this was a displacement caused by great pain, it should not be a reason to not demonstrate the beauty, the individuality, the complexities that are inherent in everyone who is in motion for one reason or whatever. And to do so is just go one by one, as simple as that may be. Why are you leaving? How does this make you feel? What would you have liked to do had things been different? What are your aspirations and what do you dream of? And putting all these questions together and codifying them through images and the written word, you come into a different reality. And I feel that it isn't anything particularly innovative, but at the very least, it does not remove the dignity and respect that should be into every one of these people who are forced to flee for one reason or another.
Yeah, and I think part of what you're doing is you're encouraging people to re-examine how they look at migrants. And I just wanted to pick up on that line that you used, human beings in motion, which I think is I just think is lovely. I wanted to ask specifically about your project, The Right to Grow Old, because I think that's a good example of your particular approach to the subject. So you followed two men from Honduras as they made their way to the US. Is that right?
I followed 5 families that in my sort of authorial sense, I felt that encapsulated different aspects of the crisis that was unfolding in Honduras. In this case, one being violence, one being economic dispossession, and so forth. But I think the case that you're referring to is the case of one young family from northern Honduras who was being chased by the different forces of violence that affect this part of the world, particularly regarding organized crime and so forth. And that's where the title comes from, was that in Honduras, the right to grow old has been abolished, that this boy did not have this inherent right to just live. And in doing so, he chose to migrate, not to join one side or another of this invisible, imaginary war. Well, not imaginary. He chose, out of his own volition, to leave as a third option, to not join into this conflict, and using migration as an act, this motion as an act to live. And in doing so, I felt that it's going towards what you've mentioned, Charlotte, and it's to complexify really what migration is not just when people going from point A to point B because of X. It's going from one place because of a galaxy of variables with an infinite possibility of outcomes. And that somehow finding the individuality within all that variance is where I think that's the power of the work that the other 2 panelists, peers and friends who are on this panel with me are, I think, doing as well.
Danielle, you've covered the same subject, but from a different angle. So Honduran migrants, transgender women who were stranded in Mexico in their effort to get to the US. Why did you focus on transgender women, and what does that shed light on the migrant experience?
Thank you. And just, before I jump in, thank you again to everyone for the invitation, and Charlie for being a star moderator and for all of your great questions. And there's so much that Tomas said that resonates with the work that I do, because it is very similar in the sense that we're focusing on the same region, and even the Northern Triangle countries of Latin America are different contexts per se than South America or Mexico. So a lot of what he said just now really resonates, and I love your work so much, Tomas and Wale. So again, it's such a pleasure to be here with both of you. So I have been focusing on communities of trans women throughout Latin America for nearly a decade now, from Argentina to Peru to Central America and Mexico. And it's an issue that I've continued to focus on because of the fact that Latin America is the deadliest region in the world for trans women. 80% of trans homicides happen in Latin America, and most trans women throughout the region don't live past 35, which are shocking and just completely unacceptable statistics. And so, much like Tomas, I had an issue with the stories that I was seeing in mainstream media that typically focus on one very narrow aspect of trans women's lives, and that is the fact that due to transphobia and lack of access to work opportunities, the majority of trans women throughout Latin America are relegated to sex work. And of course, this causes all sorts of life-threatening challenges for them. And so I really wanted to, again, like Tomas said, sort of look at all of the different layers of that and the context around that, as opposed to just this one narrow focus. And so migration was a big part of that. It's sort of an extension from my work in Peru, where most women migrate. I mean, migration is just not it doesn't have the same sort of presence that it does in Central America. Some women will migrate to Europe and some women migrate to Argentina, but it's less of a sort of, it's not like at the top of mind as an option or a solution to potentially seek a better life. And in Central America, of course, trans women face similar issues as those throughout Latin America, but they're compounded by the endemic violence of Central America with, the gang presence. And so I wanted to focus on how that context is pushing many of them to flee. And of course, migrants, in general can be put in very vulnerable situations, but for a trans woman, I believe that vulnerability can be even more intense. And so by focusing on the context of why trans women are fleeing, as well as the challenges that they face along their journey, I felt was something that was not necessarily seen in the media all the time. And so that's why I wanted to focus on that issue and hopefully continue my work in the United States, focusing on women who have arrived, who have made it to the United States, and focusing on all of the challenges that they face, resettling in a new country and sort of coming head to head with, a new reality where, of course, there are securities perhaps that they, didn't have in their home countries, but the United States is far from perfect. So I'm really interested to continue that work and see, what their experiences are like as immigrants settling in the US. So we'll see. But yeah, it's something I've been focusing on for quite a long time. So just another layer.
And, in our discussion of this subject prior to today's panel, you were talking about the feminization of mass migration, which I think is a really interesting idea. And I'd love it if you could sort of unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, so I recently led a project by 8 women photographers from the Everyday Projects to look at the impact of migration on women worldwide, from Australia, focusing on the Rohingya community, to my project in Honduras, to how climate change is affecting women in Somalia, to flee to Kenya or internally. And we wanted to focus on women because women are on the go more than ever. And of course, women face challenges that other populations don't necessarily face. And we wanted to take a deeper look again at all of those complexities and layers, because as again, Tomas mentioned, I'm sure Wale will also touch on this, it's something that we all have in common. The media tends to focus on migration as just, point A to point B, like the decision is this, it's very easy, you make it, you move, and then you arrive. But actually it's so much more complicated than that. It's so layered, it's so complex. And, women, the issue of women as it intersects with climate change, or as it intersects with, employment opportunities and migration, it just, those layers become so much more deep. And so we wanted to unpack that. And, again, just for another example that we came across in our research on this topic, to sort of highlight, again, the challenges that women face in particular, like in 2016, they moved more than half of the world's remittances. But of course, those remittances took more of the wages that women earn as migrants than men. And so even as migrants, women are facing those challenges more and more. But it's also interesting, just to sort of wrap up my answer, in my research as well, it was interesting to uncover how the feminization of migration, or the fact that women are on the go more than ever, is changing things for women culturally. For example, in the story that Saina Bashir did in Pakistan of a community of Shia women who have fled internally from Quetta to Islamabad, where they're now studying as students, I love the story of one young woman who discovered K-pop in Islamabad, and how K-pop introduced her to topics that she had never really thought about before, like the LGBTQIA community. And so, or for example, when women are on the move and are the ones moving, then they are also, they're becoming domestic workers, or, they're sending money back to their families. And of course, there's opportunity and change and evolution that happens when a woman, is employed equally as, her male counterpart, or whatever, partner counterpart. So even through migration, as people change, this is something that we had sort of talked about earlier. You cannot, as a person moves, they move with their ideas and who they are and their culture and their experiences, and then also sort of soak in wherever they are those new cultures and those new experiences. And so migration, when I imagine it, it just kind of feels like this, ebb and flow and weaving of people and cultures. And so it's inevitable that things will change, whether that's for the good or bad or both. So yeah.
Yeah, I think I certainly am already getting the impression that it's a far more complicated, the migration is a far more kind of complicated process than we in the media, portray it as such. The media has much to answer for. Wale, I'd like to turn to you. In your work, you also focus on marginalized peoples. How did you get the idea to launch Akira Jones, and how exactly does your work focus on and celebrate marginalized peoples?
So thank you for having me. This is fantastic. I stand amongst giants of peers, and yourself, Charlie, as well. It's a pleasure to meet you. My work, I think, has been, I tend to think of myself as stepping into this realm almost as a layperson would, but also having the naivety to question and to ask questions that would seem obvious, but perhaps have been pushed to the background by those who knocked their heads against the wall so many times that they look at things a certain way. So because I am a designer, my work tends to have a bit more leeway in the storytelling and to make things more stylized. And I think that is kind of the strength of what I'm able to do when we talk about stories and storytelling. So addressing your latter question first, why marginalized people? I think because I come from a background where we have the historical bias of seeing ourselves depicted in ways that are frankly less than what we know to be, in ways that have been, the potential for who we are, for the mothers and aunts and uncles and cousins that we know personally, much more is much more broad than what is seen in the very narrow images of newspapers and films and stories throughout time immemorial. So I think we are of a generation who finally have tools to tell stories. And so those of us that have kind of been afflicted with this very difficult history now feel we have a chance to correct the record in numerous different ways. So whether that be as a journalist or as an artist, in my case, as a kind of multidisciplinary storyteller, whether it's fashion or film or music, it's the idea of basically correcting the record so that people like my daughter grow up in a world that is hopefully more open, more culturally accepting than the one that her father did. So that's a really long way of saying I'm just out here trying to basically say, like, we belong here too. We also have things to contribute. And I think the idea of things to contribute for me is why, when I look at the migration issue, so much of it has been framed in the context of, as Tomas beautifully articulated, here come these waves, these hordes, these masses of people encroaching on us. And there's this sometimes expressed, sometimes subtle thing of they are coming to take what it is that we have. Rarely interrogating the idea of what you have was perhaps not yours in the first place, but that's a different issue. Oftentimes we think of migration as like, we don't have room for them, they're coming, what are we going to do? How can we keep them away? And I think that while it is a very complicated and nuanced discussion, less rarely do we articulate, well, by the way, what are they bringing? And what would we do were we in their same positions? So I think that when somebody who is able to attack this discussion from the point of view with something as fanciful, and I use that word not as a pejorative, but with the arts, in my case, with filmmaking and fashion, you get to basically have this Trojan horse or this veil that is less offensive. And so people have their guards down. And so when they're confronted with objective beauty, which is my goal, it's always intentionally supposed to be just visually stunning. It's very difficult to hate somebody who you want to be. It's very difficult to hate somebody who you're at least intrigued or attracted by. And so when it becomes, first of all, wow, they're interesting, then you become to question why they're here and what it is that made them journey so far, as opposed to seeing this like stark, inhumane depiction of those who come to take. It becomes, look at these eyes, look at this physique. There's a story here. I want to know more because this could be me. And so again, as Tomas mentioned, I don't think it's hugely innovative, but for me, it's my way to contribute to this very large and important discussion.
And with a lot of your pieces, you're sort of mashing together very disparate influences, right? So West African influences and classical European art. Why bring those two sources, those two influences together and juxtapose them in the way that you do?
Yeah, I think there are a few different ways to look at it. First of all, for me, it's a complete embrace of who I am and who we are as a culture. We are very much in a post-migration, post-colonial world. I think that there is no one who can deny that we are in all ways hugely influenced by many different cultures. And so my work makes an effort to celebrate this by showing this is the beauty that can happen when we accept and respectfully put these things together. It's also a bit of it's confrontational in that it shows that like those of us who have not been commonly embraced by these institutions of beauty, also deserve space in these same rooms, within these same frames, within these same stories. And also there's a parity. We are on equal par and our stories have equal merit. And so it's the idea that, again, for me, deliberately using language that's accepted by the whole world at this point as what beauty is, when you use that standard of beauty and inject a perspective that's not welcome or not expected, then there's this dissonance because the audience has to accept it as beautiful because it's what they've been taught. But then they now have to consider a different perspective with that language of beauty. And that to me is where it becomes interesting because it's like, well, I can't hate this. Now I have to choose to at least understand it or discuss why it makes me feel uncomfortable. And that to me is an interesting space to discuss those who are coming, whether or not we like it. We have it stands to our benefit to work to understand each other as opposed to just being afraid.
I think conflict is one big reason for migration. But Tomas, in our discussion of the subject earlier today, you made the point that so too is a longing for community, for returning to community. I wonder if you can unpack that a little bit for us.
Well, there's something that of the many lessons that last year taught us, and many findings of last year, was one that shocked me in Honduras specifically. One that has been, once that it was a country that it is almost incomprehensible to understand, that called migrants to it. My family coming from Palestine to Honduras, people from Armenia, that most people would not know of the different diasporas that you find in this country in the middle of the Caribbean, is that we turned into a country that sends people out, expulses people out due to the many different social, political, cultural reasons why, some of which I did not mention, but Danielle very pointedly made clear, is that there was this, at some point, at least in the Americas, there was, and I'm sure in the rest of the world, was you leave the countryside, you go to the city, and there you work yourself until you can send money back. The concept of remittances, which is just part of the DNA of migration, of at least probably forever, but I will only speak for the century in which I have lived in. And is remittances being sent back and forth. That's, you go somewhere to help someone with back home. In 2020, you saw these people in Honduras. You saw a lot of people, and I know this that been the case in other continents as well. People not just going across borders anymore because the borders were shut for the most part in all the world. So people started migrating instead, realizing that the siren song of the cities just wasn't really what it was going to be. The mask fell off. People started going back to the community, the ones that they left originally. So, and how this binds to the story that we had, conversation we're having right now, is I believe that internal migration, not due only to displacement as a result of conflict, as a result of any number of other things. There have been, the majority of the cases and the conversations I've had with people in Honduras, yes, I recognize this as anecdotal, is that simply put, in the cities, the life, the reason it lost its luster, it's past its prime. People have gone back to their villages, in some cases, smaller towns, hamlets, any kind of habitational unit you want to use. And in their cases, people I've spoken to, it has been a source of relief. It has been a source of something. Again, one of these lessons that you learn is that in the hustle and bustle of everything that has come before 2020, it was in some cases, for some people, these humans in motion, was just that community is large, just want to be happy. And be allowed to dream the dreams that you want and be the person that you want, clothe the way that you want to be clothed, and love who you want to love. And I know these are very saccharine terms to be having, but if you speak with someone, some of the people in the stories that Wale and Danielle have represent in their work, these are the things that they talk about. And frankly, these are the things that all of us, once we can talk about these things on a personal level, this is what matters to us as well. We were having these conversations in the green room about these subjects. So migration is going every which way. And community, I believe, is something that will only increase, or if it's always been there. 2020 revealed it to be something that's important.
And just to clarify, so that reverse migration was prompted by COVID and the fact that it had become presumably very difficult to earn a living in cities? Or are you referring to kind of a longer term process by which people have become disenchanted by cities and want to return to the villages they came from?
A bit of both. One was that yes, COVID just dried up every economic opportunity. That's understood. We don't need to. We've probably faced it all ourselves. But other side of it was that just the pressures of city living are immense in probably every city. And it's not so much a reverse migration, it's a reversal of the rural urban trend that had been predominant since post-war period. Now it's an urban to rural, not just by those who can afford to have estate homes out in the countryside. That was the case for the longest time. It's now regular people, the vast majority, choosing, not so much rejecting the urban living, but rejecting the toll it imposes.
That is really, really fascinating. I had no idea that that was a trend that was happening in the world. I sort of want to riff on this idea of community, if you hope you don't mind. Yeah, to what extent are you, with your work, trying to foster a sense of community between the migrants that you're depicting and your audience? Danielle, maybe, or Tomas, go for it.
Oh, Danielle, I feel like I spoke a lot.
Or maybe Wale? Seems
Wale,
like
please, by all means. Yeah.
I feel like
Sure.
Wale would have a good answer for that.
Yeah, so I see my work as having, if I had to break it down, two audiences. One being the collaborators themselves who I'm working with, and the other the residents of the places to which they've arrived. So I guess on a surface level, all right, anecdotal story. I came to this project and this idea several years ago as I was invited to Italy to participate in a really big fancy fashion show, which I hadn't done before. This was at the height of the migration crises when we were literally seeing people washed up on the shores of southern Italy. So for me, it was the idea that with my conscience, I couldn't go to the same place where this was happening and not do something about it as an artist. So I asked that we cast half of the models on the runway be asylum seekers. And so these are actual individuals who had just traveled across the Mediterranean. We cast them the same way that we would professional models. These are people who were physically stunning and gorgeous. They walk the runway, they all get a standing ovation. No one is the wiser. And this is the same population that's being discriminated against literally in the streets of the same city. And it's a social experiment where people realize, oh, wait a second, if I just look at a person differently in a different context, all of a sudden I see them for what they could offer. And for me, it's like, well, all right, this is done within the context of fashion. What if we did this within every context? What if you offered a job to somebody in your office? You know, we all think, well, there's nothing I can do. There's just something anybody can do. And I think for me, it's just using this literally on a stage, exposing what we can do to alleviate the anxieties we have about people we simply don't know, because we look at them within the ways that they've been presented to us. So we talk about community in that sense. It's literally presenting a population that's unknown to an audience in a way that is palatable to them and almost aspirational. But there's also equally important the impressions that these people have of themselves. So you can imagine the ordeal and the strain that happens for a person that's compelled to cross borders, Lord knows how many, under what circumstances. You think about what strain that has on their psyche, on their economics, on the family, and just in the way that they are, the trauma that's involved. Not every story is horrific, but it's certainly no vacation for anyone. And I recall the last time we had this, we photographed in southern Italy. We had a young man from the Gambia who left at the age of 15. And he's standing in a mirror wearing advertising one of my coats. And we're working on photographing. He looks in the mirror and he goes, wow, is that me? And I was like, yes, it always has been. The idea being that this person doesn't even realize that they can look. And we're not talking about being physically beautiful. That's a portion of it. But just like, oh, I can be this. And you now ask, what happens to the psyche of this person and the perception of what they can achieve, if even for that moment? They're like, wait a second. This is a lane for me, for my life, for my potential, for who I can be. We talk about the idea of representation. Why is the concept of a female president or a Barack Obama important? Not that you want to create symbols that mean nothing, but now that there are children in the world who see a Kamala Harris or Barack Obama, and like, oh, that's an option for me as well. Now that I'm a migrant who sees myself being employed, who sees myself as contributing, who sees myself on film in photographs in ways that are objectively beautiful, in ways that I would hope to be perceived, in ways that I would share happily with my family, with my grandkids. that story is entirely different from the version of migration that has kids with flies in their cheeks behind bars in a refugee camp. Because what does that do for anyone? Certainly, it can inform, and informing is necessary, but I think there are many different ways to tell a story. A good friend of mine, the author Teju Cole, says the idea that, are we here to entertain or are we here to heal? And so much of the media, and all of us are within the media, so it's not a castigation on anyone specifically, but I think we have to interrogate the intentions in the way we present stories. Because if it's to be salacious, I don't know that it serves anyone, really. Whereas if we're here to bring a community together, which I see as the specific intention and goal of all of my work, then I think that there's work to be done there, because by showing the full scope of an individual, not just highlighting their trauma, you're showing that we all suffer and that we all can persevere. And I think there is a lesson that we can all draw from in any context.
Can I just say something very quick that it's connected to the other side of the dialogue between the work and the community, that I would have never imagined, that it occurred to me right now, is that in doing these work, the work that I do, and if you look these, let's call it profiles, telling just a story, the vignette of someone's life in this slice of time, of moments in their displacement or when they settle somewhere, or even before they leave. In any case, telling the story in the way that I do, with text and the pictures and all these things that go together, you find people who empathize and say, wow, this is like what I said right now, this is me, this is all these, I've read those comments. But the one thing I never expected from an audience I never expected to reach were from people who were xenophobic to their marrow, and people who were, let's say, racially opposed to Hondurans and what they look like and what they would bring to Honduras. In this case, the United States. People who self-avowedly would tell me that they were very much just anti-immigrant, anti-this, anti-that. They would tell me in direct messages through Instagram saying, I should hate you. And then they would, this person specifically who I'm telling you, I, for the longest time, thought that Hondurans were la la la. And down came the message that he read one of the stories. And in his stories, he did not see this man, in this case, this young family who was going to take their jobs and invade their neighborhood and just tear apart the community. He saw his wife, he saw his kids, he saw himself, and he saw what he would do if he would be put in the same place that this young family was placed. And he asked for forgiveness, not to me, but to Hondurans, using me as a conduit. To paraphrase his words was, I need to apologize to someone for the hate that I put up. And that is something that you can never expect. It's totally unforeseen. And what's even more unforeseen, to double down on that, it's that it hasn't been the only time that people have reached out with these comments. And I think with what Wale is saying, with the refugees crossing the Mediterranean, or in the case of Danielle with transgender people, is that these are the other side of the connections you make with, let's call it an audience, if not community, that you do touch people's hearts, change their minds, or persuade them to believe that perhaps that the way that they were thinking before is not the only way to see and perceive people of any kind, of any class, emotion, or settled.
Well, that's really interesting, Tomas. I mean, I think that story of how that person responded to your work kind of just speaks to the potency, the power of telling individual stories. A lot of what we've been talking about today is that it boils down to the need to kind of humanize the migrant experience, right? Tomas, you were speaking earlier about, and you, Danielle, as well, how you'd wanted to sort of change the way that migrants were being portrayed in photography. They were these sort of faceless masses, and you wanted to tell a sort of more nuanced, empathetic story. Danielle, I wonder though if there's a conflict between, on the one hand, the need or the desire to kind of conjure a certain emotion, empathy, let's say, within the viewer, but also your commitment to objectivity as a photojournalist?
So I get to take the really, really hard question. I'm kidding. Yeah, I mean, I think the question of objectivity, as someone who has been trained as a journalist, I studied photojournalism in university, and there are certainly many, many rules within journalism, some which are absolutely necessary and probably should never change, such as, tell the truth and be transparent and honest, and, don't Photoshop your images to take or remove things. I mean, those are pretty hard and fast rules that I think, should stay. I think, though, the conversation around bias and is a little bit more complicated. It's more nuanced. It's not so, there's so many different shades of gray. And I think that we are all humans as well. And we have our viewpoints about what is right and what is wrong, and what makes one thing a human rights abuse and what makes another thing an injustice. And I believe that there are different, like, I guess just speaking personally with my work on trans communities, my viewpoint is pretty clear, I think, if you look at my work, and not only my documentary work, but what I've done with that documentary work. I mean, the work that I did in Peru, I created a photo book that we distributed free of charge to universities and healthcare centers throughout Peru. And I hope to, from the work that I'm doing now, I have another hopeful plan that will eventually work out, where it would also use photography as a way to inform and educate and provide resources. And so, of course, there's that line between, activism and journalism. And I think that for me, it just stems from the fact that I chose to be a photographer because I want to raise awareness about issues in a visual way that compels people to action, that compels society to change in a positive way. And sometimes photography just doesn't feel like enough, or the picture itself. And so how can we use photography in more powerful ways across disciplines, which Wale is really great at and is very inspiring. But I just think, it's, again, I didn't choose to be a photographer to simply record history. I chose to be a photographer because because I want positive change in the world, and the camera is simply my tool of doing that. I mean, I could have picked any tool, I could have been many things, but I picked the camera. But that doesn't change my intention. And I think that for me, it doesn't make me any less of a journalist. I think that, if anything, hopefully sort of refocusing on impact makes us more empathetic. And then that translates to our work, which hopefully translates to the viewer. And I think that that's the end goal. So, yeah.
I mean, that's just utterly fascinating. I think that's just I think what I took from that was that you're using objective methods, right? This is how you can use photography. These are the tools of the trade to portray what's really out there in front of your eyes. But you can deploy those pictures towards specific ends in the furtherance of your activism. We're drawing to a close now, but I think there's time for one more question. We've spoken a lot today about how culture can reframe mass migration. I think there's also an interesting question here of how mass migration is reshaping culture. Danielle, you've discussed that a little bit earlier on when talking about the experience of those women in Pakistan. Well, I wonder if you have any thoughts on this.
Yeah, so concrete anecdotal example, in the region of Calabria, which is southern Italy, it's a generally economically depressed region. It's not necessarily where one of us would be going on a vacation as a tourist. However, it's it calls to what Tomas was mentioning earlier with the youth fleeing the cities and going to the country. You have towns that are not doing well, bringing in migrants and asylum seekers to bolster these kind of towns that are falling apart. And so we walk in there to work on a film, and you have images of young Middle Eastern and African refugees building a school that's fallen apart. And the idea being that not only do these migrants inform culture, they're literally building up the foundations for the next generation. And so we think of these people not just as labor and hands that can work for us, but people who can actually help to repopulate, to build our future, and then inform in ways that are more tactile, ways that touch the culture, ways that really from a one-to-one situation that we are really informed about each other and what we believe in a way that isn't fearful, in a way that doesn't harp on our anxieties. And I think that we often forget just the human individual context that we have. So yes, we're all aware of like things like music and restaurants, but there's also the individual small nuanced moments that people have that really go on to influence entire families and generations and perceptions of these people. It's like, but I met this one guy and he helped me lay bricks and he helped me cross the street. And, it's just like, and I taught him a bit of Italian and back and forth. And I think it's in those really small moments that are less seen on the headlines. This is where culture is born. This is where assimilation in a way that doesn't rob people of their heritage happens. And this is really the beauty the migration can bring. It's small moments between people.
Yeah, it strikes me that as more and more migration happens, as societies get more and more diverse, those cultural touchstones, as you put it, Wale, things that sort of bind humans together, regardless of culture, or race, or ethnicity, music, food, etc., will become actually all the more important to help us to kind of understand each other and find those little moments of empathy. Yes, I'm afraid we'll have to end it there. But thank you all so very much for your time.